Greetings and welcome back to another discussion on my channel. Today I'm very fortunate to be joined by a very unique individual who has a proper perspective on the nature of being a Hungarian-American, far more than I, because he actually speaks the language proficiently, has lived there for quite some time, and grew up in a different setting. And so the focus of this talk will be, I suppose, his origins, when he's originally from Los Angeles, and the relationship of the United States to Europe more generally, and Hungary specifically, his experiences there, and the differences, whether they're nuanced or extreme. And he's very knowledgeable about this, so I'm appreciative that he's here. So let's start the discussion with a little bit of a talk about Los Angeles, or Los Diablos. It's a city that I personally have no fondness for. I've only been there a few times, but it just seems like a giant urban sprawl of a mess with very little culture or very little of anything. Few museums. It's just sort of, I don't know, it seems to me many times as an outsider as kind of to be an epicenter of so many things that are wrong with the United States. So I'm curious, as a native LAer, what your perspective on that is.
Well, I think, first of all, hi. And I think you pretty much made a great summary of what Los Angeles is. But I would take, I would dispute that little bit about no culture, because I think it's a place that's so seeped in, how should I say, the American identity crisis that it has a culture of its own. And it's not something I would say is positive in any way, but I think, when you grow up in a place that is urban sprawl like that, place where, so much is out of reach, I think, for the average person, I think that lends itself to its own sort of cultural life, which, basically means, I don't know, smoking weed or taking pharmaceuticals and
is that what counts as a cultural life in Los Diablos?
Well, I would say that culture, I think, don't want to go off on a tangent here, but I think culture comes from comparisons, comes from contrast. And so, I mean, for a Hungarian, for instance, they would look at that and they would say that that's the cultural life of America, or the cultural life of California or Los Angeles, right? Mm-hmm. So it depends on your perspective, right? So if we look at European culture and we hold it to some ideal, then sure, the Los Angeles cultural life, quote unquote, pales in comparison to like Vivaldi.
Yeah.
But it is a culture of its own, and you, for better or worse.
Well, I wouldn't disagree with that. In fact, I mean, you could. There's a culture in living in some backwater in the Midwest of the United States, because that'll have its set of customs and routines and rituals, and I get that. But I suppose what we really, well, at least what I mean about sort of culture, is something that is fundamentally fulfilling in a way that I would find it's hard to argue for any major urban city in the United States, but LA in particular, because LA is sort of this embodiment of the superficial and the vacuous, at least to my mind, the outside perspective. It's where people go to, get rich or to find their fame. And I'm sure LA is awash with the tears of those failures, tears we never bear witness to, and we never hear the weeping either. But
well, I would say that's certainly true. I would say it's certainly true that a lot of people look to Los Angeles and have looked, for the past 50 years or so, to Los Angeles as a place where they can where they can find fame. It's more than like I would say these days it's less and less of a Hollywood thing and more of a broader sort of. I would put it in the same category as Brooklyn, where you want to make your break in whatever industry you're part of. It's just it's a center point of trade. It's a place with a lot of resources that are in the minds of many just there waiting to be taken. And so, yeah, I mean, you do get a situation where people are basically just trying to find that golden path, and find that opportunity that they can't find at home. So you do end up with a lot of people who are just there to strive, and a lot of times, yeah, just for material gain. And yeah, I mean, what's interesting about LA, and one of the things, because I should say that I was by no means, I didn't come from a family of poor means. We did have resources. I had resources growing up. I basically had anything that I could have asked for as a kid, and I mean, later on it was all lost, but. We basically went from having a lot of money to having no money. And I think, just interestingly, what you find on both sides of the economic spectrum there is that there is that lack of meaning that you're talking about. And those tears that you're talking about are shed by people who manage to hold on to their wealth and people who never attain it. So I feel like that in and of itself is, in a way, the culture of the place. Is finding out that these kind of pursuits are just empty at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I think
Go
this is
ahead.
well embodied in the idea that once you strike fame and achieve your fortune, then the sole purpose of your existence as a celebrity dwelling in Hollywood or Los Angeles is just to maintain that in perpetuity. The meaning of your life is this fame. It is the celebrity status. And I'm sure people could argue against that, but it's kind of their livelihood. If you're a famous actor, then it's in your best interest to maintain your employment, to maintain your e-status and what have you. And so, yeah.
Right, or as a business person, if you're the owner of a company, you could be doing anything. I mean, you could be selling lumber.
Yeah.
And if you make a lot of money, then you still find out that it doesn't solve your problems.
Yeah.
And I think a characteristic trait of Los Angeles, but I think you could say the same about Manhattan. I think a characteristic trait is that you have that floss going on where you're like trying to show off how much, how far better off you are. You're always comparing with your peers, and you're sort of pursuing wealth for wealth's sake. And I think that's very much the case in Los Angeles. Though I think what's really changed is, and this is kind of moving on, but I think what's really changed is that now you have a generation of people in the States who, I mean, wealth inequality is higher than ever. But in a place like LA, you're going to be, if you grow up on, say, the West Side, if you grow up in Santa Monica and Beverly Hills and those kinds of places, then you're basically surrounded by people who are all well off and who are the children of people who are well off. And it's such a huge geographical space that's full of wealthy people that wealth and the pursuit of wealth almost becomes a non-issue. So you have people who are from their birth just immersed in this existential crisis of, what am I pursuing in life? What do I want? Because they already have everything.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it is a contradiction, but on the face of it, it does seem to be a contradiction that when you're born with a silver spoon in your mouth, the only trajectory you can envision, what I was not born with one, but I would imagine at least is to move ever higher up that ladder. And whereas if you're struggling with basic existence and your needs, paying rent and the bills and groceries, the space between you and your quote unquote dreams and goals seems greater, and it's even not necessarily unreasonable to, as your primary goal in life, even your meaning, to try to move up that ladder.
Well, interestingly, I think that that's something that's very different in the United States, and the area where I experienced a different reality is where you said that the goal is sort of to maintain your wealth and to increase it. And I would say that these people aren't necessarily that practical. I would say that they're not very good at that, actually. Um, I would say that most Marxists belong to that silver spoon class, for instance, if I'm making my point clear. A lot of the people who are from the wealthier part of Los Angeles are very, very liberal. A lot of them espouse Marxist, they espouse altruistic points of view, and they actually don't want to make their lives about increasing their wealth. They have some sort of how should I say, post 1968 philosophy that life is all about, how should I say, making a peaceful world and overcoming war and overcoming inequality, and they actually, in order to not hate themselves, well, first of all, they medicate themselves heavily, incredibly heavily. It would be that with legal or illegal drugs and alcohol or no alcohol. They medicate themselves heavily, and they tell themselves that they are oppressed. And that's not something I've come into this conversation wanting to beat. But, to move the conversation forward, I have to say that exact point of delusional people who cast themselves in a role that's alien to them is the reason why I wanted to leave. Because I grew up with people like that, and I could say that I never really espoused those beliefs. I never really had that kind of image of my place, and I never really envisioned my place in the world that way. I should say that I definitely would, had my family kept their wealth, I definitely would belong to the class of greedy hoarders who want to make things, who want to expand their enterprise, who want to expand their holdings. So I would probably become, a Republican.
Right.
But
this phenomenon, though, if I might ask, do you feel in your estimation that it's very localized to LA?
No. I feel like it belongs to coastal metropolises. However you say that word.
Yes.
Metropolis. Yes. American and Greek fused together, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, commentary regarding Manhattan, it's New York City. I'm sure you visited, and I grew up on the opposite
I've
end.
never been to New York.
Oh,
I should say that right off the bat. But I do have a cousin who spent most of his adult life there. Brooklyn is his ideal in life.
I think New York's very different in some ways and similar. So most of us who grew up in New York who weren't born into wealth were so-called borough commuters. Now, New York has 5 different boroughs, and to experience New York, you kind of need to be in Manhattan. I'd say 80% of the things roughly of quote-unquote importance are in Manhattan. And I grew up in the Bronx, and if you live outside of that, to get that experience, you need to commute, which is depends on the distance, but it's a while to get there sometimes. And it used to be, this has changed, because when my parents retired in the 90s, they couldn't afford the real estate in Manhattan, so they decided to stay in the Bronx. But they wanted to move down to Manhattan because they were the types of people that partook of the culture or what have you. And that is, I think, a critical difference, is that New York, at the very least, on the surface, has a pretension to high culture that Los Angeles does not, because there are lots of museums there. There are embassies there. It's sort of it's a direct conduit, if only because it's closer to Europe, to sort of the old world in some sense. Museum of Metropolitan Art, the Guggenheim, Natural History, all these things. And so there's that pretension. I think it's a pretension. I don't think it's genuine that's there. And so you can partake in that. At the same time, through the vast conglomerate of different cultures and ethnicities and I have to be honest, people not really mixing with each other, it doesn't really give you an authentic sense of real culture. It's artificial, and so you can go to the Museum of Natural History or the Museum of Metropolitan Art, partake of Renaissance paintings and 16th century armor displays, and think, well, that's great, and then you go back to this effectively empty mess. And every New Yorker who's left New York tends to communicate to me the same sentiment, even though we might have completely different backgrounds. So, yeah.
Well, I just I guess the first thing I would say to that is that, well, Hollywood does have a pretension to culture, and it's very extreme. So
is it a pretension to high culture though? So that's the pretension that you find in New York. It's a
pretension to sort of their modernist, postmodernist kind of, we're not Europe, we're the next level kind of pretension. Yeah, it's definitely not trying to be high European culture. Although I would say that actually for the very well off, when it comes to fashion, when it comes to abstract modern art, actually Los Angeles is a center of culture. And you would find a lot of European upper class people who spend a considerable amount of time in Los Angeles and in California as a whole, because there are a lot of artists there. And I wouldn't say that, I don't want to say that I wouldn't buy their art, but I wouldn't want to say that it represents something completely alien from, I think, the kind of culture you're trying to talk about, which is to say culture rooted in our history and culture that is related to an identity. Because,
yeah.
I mean, this is what we're really delving into here is, do you regard modern post-identitarian culture as culture at all? Because it sounds like you don't.
I mean, I wouldn't. A couple of things there. I do think it's a type of culture, and talk about that, but I would agree with you that, if anything, the West Coast, Los Angeles culture is a kind of reinvention, whereas I said in New York, it's sort of pretensions to the old world. I mean, there was some guy, the Cloisters, who removed an entire monastery and had it basically shipped over to New York, and you can visit there, and that kind of thing. It's a sort of pretension in New York. You have the New World wealth, but it's sort of clinging to the past, and that's embodied in the museums, in things like Little Italy, and all these other sort of ethnic communes. There used to be, in the 50s and 60s, there was, after Budapest, it had the largest Hungarian community in the world. These kinds of things. That it's different. New York never tried to reinvent itself. It made an attempt at continuity between a European past and a modernity, but at the same time, New York is filled with non-Europeans, and so that kind of disrupts any attempt at any sense of continuity. And what you end up is this sort of brown morass, this mass of just, what the hell is this? Now, as to your other question, whether or not sort of post-identitarian culture is, of course, I do think it's a culture. You're a millennial. I'm Generation X now, so there's a gap there. But I do identify, for example, millennial culture, and then everything that comes after this post-identitarian culture, as a kind of culture of almost common interest. So it can be as cheesy and superficial as, oh, you like playing StarCraft? I do too. Let's spend our days and nights playing StarCraft and talking about how the Protoss are better than the Zergs, or vice versa. And that, in a sense, is a culture. The internet emerges and what have you. It's a different, I've argued this in past videos, it's a different type of identitarianism. It's an identitarianism of shared external experience rather than heritage and the past, if that makes sense.
No, it makes sense, yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's valid in a sense, and I think as long as we have modern technology and the internet and a video game culture, just as an example, that will persist. But I don't think it gives people a traditional sense of fulfillment. And now we're kind of coming to this, you could say it's sort of the Hungarian-American's dilemma. Because I recently talked to you, and I talked to, frankly, and some other people, and I've talked to a bunch of Hungarian-Americans throughout my life. All of us have slightly different backgrounds. And you actually properly speak the language, and so I feel in some sense inadequate talking to the point. But I do have to say that there's that sense of just confusion. Every Hungarian I met in my life, including myself, in 20 years' time, there's a sort of not really knowing where exactly they belong, and that might apply to other, ethnicity, European ethnicity, or even just any ethnicity that's kind of lodged in the States. But it clearly, the dissatisfaction you had in LA culture and in a broader sense American culture made you want to leave it and move forward. So, what was sort of the trigger, the straw that broke the camel's back that made you want to leave?
Well, I mean, it was. To be honest, I mean, it wasn't a matter of, actually, I didn't take it upon myself to leave just as I'm going to Hungary and that's it. I'm going to give up everything and go to Hungary. It was more of a case of I was invited here by my family, and when I came here, I decided that I wanted to be here. It was, I mean, I was always dissatisfied. We all have our points of dissatisfaction with our life, and I think it's incredibly fair to say that Los Angeles is a place where you can feel trapped by. I guess that goes for any place, really. So I might be, talking shit here, but I felt incredibly trapped by my environment, and I really didn't think of leaving as a possibility. I measured my possibilities within my environment, and leaving it was actually something that was a very alien thought to me. But when I came to Hungary, I came here for the first time in 2015. I immediately felt like this was a better opportunity for me. It was a place that was, to my senses, more fulfilling. And I should also say that as an American who wasn't doing particularly well in my home city, I mean, I have work training, but you're looking at the amount of money you can make. You're looking at the amount of the kind of neighborhoods that you can live in and the kind of neighbors that you're going to have, because you don't have any. And I should say that for me, it's out of the question to take out a gigantic loan, to take out tens of thousands of dollars to go to a university. To me, is the biggest nightmare I could imagine.
Oh, it's a scheme, and it's a scheme that's conned many an American. Actually, I have another Hungarian-American friend, and I talked to him last week, and when he told me how much debt he had, $250,000.
That's incredible. That's unbelievable.
I told him, I said, dude, if I were a multimillionaire, I would just pay off all your debts. But I think he'll be probably paying it back until his grave.
Well, I mean, honestly, the debt and the education equation in the States is part of being a card-carrying American. It's basically your initiation ritual. You should be in debt and you should be indoctrinated.
It's pure tomfoolery. I don't have any debt, and I through a combination of working and attending public university, etc. But I could have accumulated debt. So I got accepted to a few Ivy League universities that, I'd applied for the right loans. I might have, me not being a minority in their eyes, I couldn't have gotten those types of easy passes. But, could have done it, but what would have been the point at the end of the day? Still got an education by attending a public university, and I don't have any outstanding debt to this day. There's still financial concerns, but I can only imagine. Because the thing is, if you think about it with debt, the kind of debt that's accumulated through the processes of the educational industrial complex, as I refer to it, is that, it's not as if the debt somehow alleviates your other daily financial concerns, like paying the rent or having enough to pay the electricity costs or the internet, or all these things that everyone kind of needs these days. It's just on top of that, every month, in theory, you're going to have to subtract whatever it is from your income to and it's almost, I'm sure you're familiar with the myth of Sisyphus, right?
No.
Okay, so Sisyphus was a a guy in ancient Greece, in theory, it's a myth, obviously, who defied the gods. And as punishment, he was forced to push a giant boulder up a hill. And every time he came close to the precipice, it would roll back down. And the French philosopher Camus wrote a book, The Myth of Sisyphus. And I find that the whole American debt scheme, it's like we call it Sisyphean work. It's akin to that because you're sort of putting money in the pot for this imaginary day when your hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt are paid off, but it probably will never arrive. That's kind of how I look at it.
But that's it, yeah, and so that's the whole idea. Is that's why I call it the initiation ritual, because, and I love your analogy, by the way. I see that it's the first transaction that gets you started on that boulder pushing. It's, as an adult, your first experience with debt should be right off the bat. If you want to be successful in society, you must acquire debt. And I got to say, living in a cash society, and we're straying from the topic, but I think this is a very interesting point. In a society that's a cash economy, I honestly, I've come to believe, strangely enough, that the whole debt-based system has a very concrete set of upsides to it. And in some ways I kind of miss it. In some ways I kind of wish that I would have been born ignorant and that I would have lived my life in that system. But it's too late for that. So I'll use that as a branch to take us back into the whole.
As far as the upsides are concerned, I mean, as neither you nor I have this outstanding debt, and so we're looking at it from the perspective of an outsider. I guess you could almost say it forms a common cultural experience. You meet up with John at the bar and say, "Hey, man, I just I dropped $2K on my debt. Oh yeah, I just dropped $3K next month's that kind of thing." And everyone knows the debt that they're talking about. This sort of united debt experience. But I mean, it's
also a matter of when you're used to taking on debt for things. Well, first of all, in the United States, they've really standardized the credit rating system, which means that if you are playing by the rules, then you have a good credit rating. Now that gives you access to, and you know all this obviously, but this is something that I tell to Hungarians and they're dumbfounded by it. So if you have your good credit rating, then you can take out a lease on a BMW. The way it looks to a Hungarian, if they want a BMW, then they have to pay a huge down payment in cash, and they should probably do it in Slovakia to avoid paying a 34% tax on it. And then they have to pay. They think of things as actual purchases, which means that a Hungarian is unless they're incredibly wealthy, they're not going to ever have a BMW. Whereas a middle-class American can look at a BMW or a brand new Dodge or a new Cadillac as a reasonable monthly expense in many cases.
An ongoing expense that you just eventually pay off through some.
And the idea of a car lease, that's so alien to people in an economy like this.
Yeah.
Whereas to have a great Kia, and you're paying $300 a month for it, right? If you have a good rating.
Yeah.
Now you're paying $350 a month for a brand new Kia. It gets great gas mileage. It's safe. It's comfortable. It's got all of the fucking screens you need in life. And for a Hungarian, they're like, well, I have this 15-year-old Opel, and I'd be lucky to keep it running because I can't afford another car.
Yeah, and that's not too dissimilar. It's the irony that I'm a non-German who's most experienced with German culture, and it's not too dissimilar here. People, at least proper Germans, they're not ones to play around with unnecessary debt. They tend to be very cautious with their finances, and the idea of just sort of putting a down payment on something and then praying to the gods that at some point in time it will actually become your acquisition or your property is a bit odd, I think, to most Germans. And I didn't growing up in a European household, I didn't really get exposed to that mentality either, that you're not supposed to spend money that you don't have. That's alien to me. And of course I was born in the 70s. I'm a different generation. there was a time in the States when that too was somewhat alien as well, and I think I was kind of at the cusp of that generation that still grasped the concept that you just shouldn't spend tons of money on things you don't money that you don't have based on a faulty promise. And I think that's, if anything, that probably is one, ironically, that financial cultural shift, if we want to call it that, is one of the, I think, marks of delineation between my generation and your generation going forward. I
would say that. Well, I would say that that's almost correct, but I mean, my dad is considerably older than you. Not considerably. He's probably 13 years older than you, if I was to guess your age. 13 to 15 years older than you, and he just. He built all of his wealth and everything on debt, and I think it depends on. I think it depends a lot on what your goals are now, and it also depends on how much of a risk taker you are. I think that you're absolutely correct in saying that it's a continental European attitude to not operate on debt. Now, the English have always been different. They've always been borrowers and lenders. And
have they been, or has it been someone else? Dun dun dun. Sorry.
Get those parentheses out, boy.
Sorry, I just had to say that. Go on.
Well, it's interesting because no, I'm not. I have to say, I have to be really clear on this. I'm not a Jewish conspiracy guy, but I do want to convey it because I just couldn't help but think of it. Something that my friend said to me today, because I was having a little bit of nostalgia time about America, and Hungarians are often interested, so I get to play on my little nostalgia when I tell people about what life was like there, and he's just like, you're so Hungarian, but why do you have to belong to one of the two Jewish countries in the world? And he's we can deduce what those two are, and one of them is not England. To their defense.
No,
but there's truth to that, I guess. But on a serious note, what I wanted to say was that I think that I'm not so sure that you should regard your attitude towards borrowing as a generational thing, because I think that the borrowing attitude began in the U.S. in the Great Depression, and it was definitely thriving in the 1920s as well. And that's one of the reasons why the Great Depression happened. But I think that America was riding off of so much success after World War II that there wasn't a need for the average consumer to borrow money. But as we see now, the U.S. government was borrowing out of its ass. I mean, it was burrowing under a giant pile of debt, and that starts with World War II.
I wonder, though, if there's not a connection to the inception of the Federal Reserve, and
there's absolutely a connection.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's undeniable that there's on some level, a kind of Anglo Jewish connection to that sort of thing.
There's a culture where there's a culture of. Listen, I don't even want to begin to pretend that I'm economically literate, just like I wouldn't pretend that I'm sociologically literate.
No, dude, you're just here to speak your mind, so feel free.
But as far as I can tell, and I'm just very much from the camp of, like, if you don't know what you're talking about, then shut up. And that's a Hungarian thing, by the way, which we can get into later. But don't look stupid on camera. Let me put it that way. And but my thought on the matter is, there's a culture that the English have that normalizes debt, and it normalizes speculation. And initially in the United States, one of the founding principles really of the United States was a rejection of that. And it was sort of a return to real value-based economy.
The battle between Alexander Hamilton and the other founding fathers, whether or not there should be a centralized bank, for example, back in the day.
Sure. And it was possible in the United States to... Now, a thing you have to understand about England in the first place is that it's a country that doesn't have a natural source of gold or silver. So you have to understand that from the very beginning of English apartness from Central Europe, from continental Europe, the erosion of the Roman Empire, England had to find another way to be a player in international into the international economy.
You have an Anglo, by the way. You mentioned you have an Anglo background. Your other half is Anglo.
Yeah,
right?
half of my family. Well, I guess they're Irish, but they act like a bunch of fucking Anglos.
Okay,
I mean,
fair
it's clear as day where
Right.
they get the behavior from. But just one sec. A little water. So I think it's clear to me why England is the way it is. Now, Hungary is clearly not that way, and Germany isn't that way either. But incidentally, Hungary was actually the gold minting superpower of the High Middle Ages. So Hungary was never at a shortage of gold. So we were just fine in continental Europe and in Italy. Everyone was just fine with a gold-backed economy, with an economy backed in an arbitrary method of measurement.
Yeah.
Whereas
if I might, I don't want to sound conspiratorial because I don't think it, but I mean, it's clear that the formation of a central bank that distributes currency to the entire populace just allows for, whether it's an intentional plot to control, it does allow for greater control than a decentralized economy that is largely based on gold-backed whatever, or some sort of hard asset. And that the entire world has taken to this tune in the subsequent decades, and now it's been over a century since the inception of the Federal Reserve in the States, and it's just sort of, we're never going back there, but I do think it's kind of unquestioned dogma that this is just the way the financial universe operates. We have central banks, and that's what it is and how it is.
But that's in the interest of the ruling class. It's not a big surprise to me because the class that's in power wants to. This is a perennial rule in class relations. The class in power, just like the feudal class would have normalized serfdom.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or Kim Jong-un and the Korean Communist Party normalize communism.
Yeah. And
they keep people in ignorance. And so it's really there are no just systems of rulership. That's a mistake. And there you can never rely on on a ruling party to be just, no matter how big their talk is. And the same goes for the United States. The same goes for all this shit they talk about in English history about the struggle for the liberty of who? The liberty of who? The merchant class. Were they interested in the liberty of everyone? It's a bunch of bullshit. And all governments are inherently oppressive, and they're inherently interested in perpetuating their rule. But I guess what I would say when we talk about
sounds very libertarian of you, by the way.
I do lean quite libertarian when it comes to politics, and I believe in personal enterprise. And
that's a very Anglo attitude, by the way.
Yeah, it is, and it's something I chafe against a lot here in Hungary, actually, because as much as I would definitely say that my heart is here and my heart is with this mentality, because how should I say? Hungarians, I would say, I don't want to sound like I have it all figured out, like I think I have it all figured out, but if Hungarians are very, very self-critical, and it's very, very hard for Hungarians to delude themselves because there's a sort of complex of self-analysis that we have, where we wake up every morning and we look in the mirror and we find all the problems, and we don't look at a lot of the positives. And of course, you can delude yourself in that direction as well, where you only see problems. But I would just say that Hungarians are very good problem finders.
Mm.
And we take joy, and I don't want to talk about them like, it's a hive mind or something. And I also don't want to claim Hungarian. It feels so wrong to do that because I didn't experience it.
Yeah.
But I find so much in common with people here that it's really hard not to. But I guess the bottom line that I was trying to get at is that, how should I say? I feel like I'm a Hungarian at heart, but I also think that there's a lot of points where the Hungarians defeat themselves because they're so mired in this sort of continental attitude. And I think one of those big failings in Hungary is to create a dynamic economy and to become people who Hungarians have great ideas. They're incredibly intelligent, but they don't have the confidence to realize them. And they also are not they're not willing to, I don't want to say cheat people, because Hungarian people cheat people all the time, especially each other. But they're not willing to go out there like a salesman and put their idea out there. And at all costs, let's get sales, and let's push our ideas. And they don't view the world in those terms. They're not good merchants. They're terrible merchants. Let me just put it that way. And that's something that I feel like is crucial to the success of a nation, because when you sell products, you sell ideas and you sell a way of life. And that's what, and the Americans, with the wind behind their back because of their global dominance of the fiat banking system, because let's have no illusions about the fact that the United States is the biggest benefactor of fiat currency and its adoption around the world. And all currencies are measured against the dollar. And that, plus their military, plus their totally gung-ho attitude about selling the world their products and ideas, makes the United States tip-top. And Hungary is a nation of 10 million that is dying out because not only can they not sell other people on their ideas, but they are getting sold American ideas.
Well, if I might interject, I mean, this is a fundamental problem across the globe, because American culture, Anglo-American culture, I'd argue it's not really Anglo-American culture. It's a kind of modification. But I don't want to. People accuse me of a tinfoil hat here. A modified form of American culture has spread throughout the globe, and it's a culture of consumerism, consumption, selling, and just having stuff. And of course, it's a human want to, or basic desire to, increase one's status and to have a better lifestyle. If you're living in a hut, it seems plausible that living in a proper house with supermarkets around you would be better. But the problem with the American culture, and it is a kind of culture, I'm not denying that it is a culture, is that it's, as you pointed out, it lames the other aspects of culture that might have value. And I think what we're facing fundamentally throughout the world, not just the Western world, incidentally, as many people perceive, but also in East Asian cultures like South Korea.
Well, you lived there.
I lived in South Korea, yes, and this.
Well, China is following much the same. I was in Japan for 6 weeks. That's my experience with East Asia.
Yeah, but I mean, this and so
China's
it's not
following the same.
Oh yeah, and I have a friend who lives in Taiwan, and he reports much the same. And so, the entire world is locked in a conflict between a kind of assignment of value, and the fundamental question of that assignment of value is one or either and it isn't an either or, I don't think, but the way that people perceive it is, in fact, and in practice becomes that. Either value is contained in economic prosperity, consumerism, getting stuff, etc. That's sort of the I guess the Anglo Jewish perspective, or it is it's retained in sort of maintain your roots, adhering to traditions, maintain the language, customs, etc. And I don't know if these can fundamentally exist in a state of parity, because I think that once the former intrudes, the latter has to recede. And I think both have value in some sense, because obviously prosperity, if you're affected by disease and poverty, ideally you want to get out of that. And in that sense, free markets have been wonderful.
It's not just disease and poverty. It's just also looking at your neighbors and seeing that they have something better, which is why I would, I accept your point. But I think that, and this is definitely a belief, because I thought exactly like you before I left. But coming here, I see that the real weakness is that the cultures that we want to maintain are not empowered. They're not on the offensive when it comes to spreading their way of life, when it comes to validating that. And so I think really, and I guess I'll make today's manifesto, because I don't claim to be an expert. I don't have it all solved. But what I think right now, when it comes to this question of how do we save cultures that we cherish from dying out, like true multiculturalists, right? I'm a multiculturalist all the way. I believe in more and more cultures and more strong cultures. I really hate cultural homogeny. To me, it's the most dangerous thing that we could do, just to paint the whole world with one culture. But I think that the way to go about that is, like, you can't artificially preserve them. If you believe in it, this is one of the reasons why I want to live in Hungary. And this is one of the reasons that, after the initial honeymoon period, I see a future for myself here, even if it means I leave and come back, because I think that you need to live in that culture that you love, and you need to have that enterprising attitude, and you need to pick the people around you up by the bootstraps, and my white savior complex, right? You need to pick the people up around you by the bootstraps, and you need to give them the tools that they need to, within the framework of their own culture, go on the offensive. Yeah. And that has to be achieved economically, because economics are where we fight the battles of today.
I mean, you sound like the eternal Anglo there, and yeah, I totally get that.
It's just that I don't want it to be Anglo-colored. I believe in the Anglo mentality, and this is something that, because I was shitting all over it before I left, but I see that what you need to do is you need to take that blueprint for success, and you need to keep what makes it successful and change what makes it odious,
right?
Basically.
And different things have different value. It's unquestionable that there are advantages to certain approaches to things and advantages to others. I mean, as someone who's never lived in Hungary, but by way of your description, this sort of, I guess you call it introspective pessimism, I am, shot through with that. That's something that I find discordant with, I guess, Anglo culture in general, specifically American culture. The English are not nearly as bad as Americans in this regard, this sort of eternal optimism and the cult of positivity that's formed in the modern Western American world, specifically, or North American world. I don't know if that's because I think in some sense that is leading to destruction of our civilization. Even as we observe Europe, specifically continental Europe, but of course England is as much victim as any other place these days, awash in its own fall, and through terrible policies and importing a hostile foreign culture. There's a kind of optimism that I even think, at least in Western Europe, because that's what I can say speak more to, has been sort of pseudo-adopted from the Anglo tradition, that, somehow chin up, you're going to get through all of this. And this sort of somehow, the problem with somehow is somehow isn't introspective, somehow doesn't tell you how you're going to go about it. It's just somehow we'll get through this. It's, there's a famous thing that Merkel said in "Wir schaffen das" in German. We'll manage it. We'll do it somehow. That's not a traditionally German sentiment.
No. That's very far from the German tradition.
Yeah, yeah, and so it's something alien that is, I think, is a sort of almost cultural bug, an infection, that people cannot look at our current problems. I think it's clear the current problem in Europe is this. The first and primary problem is the Muslim invasion and its alien nature, and how people just don't even want to address it, but it's transforming the societies. And and this sort of, we're just going to somehow deal with this, or it'll be fine anyway, isn't going to cut the mustard.
No, I definitely agree that kind of gung-ho optimism, when the facts are starkly in opposition to that, that's toxic, and that's one of those things that I think that I would consider, like I said, you need to cut out the odious parts and keep the good ones. That's one of those odious parts. So I think, and it's a very, very tight rope to walk, where you want to be enterprising and you want to look at everything as an opportunity, but you also have to know where to draw the line, and that's one of those things I can't even pretend to have the answer to, but I think that that's the right direction, and I definitely believe that self-delusion is the worst way to go. But
that's speaking specifically of Hungary and the countries that formerly lay under the burden of the Iron Curtain. I've offered this thesis before, in particular in Western Europe, that I call it in German sort of a weariness of fighting, that centuries and centuries of constant conflict over all sorts of things have laid waste to any sort of fighting spirit that had been present in Western continental Europe, and specifically in the sense that there's World War II and then World War I, the Napoleonic Wars, wars of religion, so many wars, internecine conflicts between many different countries in Europe, and in the end, it all turned out to be for naught. It turned out to be sort of for these ideologies that failed us, that led nowhere, and in fact, primarily to death and destruction, and people just, they had it, and so there's a kind of cultural continuity of weariness that is carried over. Now, it is claimed, I can't verify this, that the new generation, the generation that isn't attached to that, say the generation born in the late 90s or the 2000s, will have a different view of these things. But I see this as kind of omnipresent in every Western European country of any note. And you, on the other hand, a place like Hungary or Slovakia or Poland, there's a kind of, Douglas Murray calls it a sense of the tragedy of life. I was talking to an Irish guy, ironically, the other night.
That's definitely true.
That even the Irish have maintained. I've always had this reverence for Ireland, because there's a kind of melancholy in the air that you can detect. It's for all the things that the Irish have lost, they still maintain something that's uniquely theirs, and they've lost so much, and yet if you reach out, you can kind of touch it, even as a foreigner. And that sense of tragedy, that sense that there used to be something here and we lost so much, and whatever remains, we must sort of cling to that. We need to make an effort to maintain that, is completely vacant and absent in Western continental Europe. It's lost in England at the very least.
I think it has a lot to do with the fact, and I would say that this really, I could even tie this back to my peers in Los Angeles back when I had money. They've never lost anything. They don't know what it feels like. They don't know what it is. And you know, the old adage, you don't know what you have until you lose it, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's so much true for France. Yeah, I think that's
Germany,
true for France.
Netherlands.
Well, I think the Germans know loss very, very profoundly.
Well, they know loss, but they can't square it with their past.
Yeah, I don't want to. Again, I'm not trying to say I know better on this than you because you live there, but I think that's the problem. In my estimation and my feeling of the issue, I think the problem is more that their whole perspective on things is clouded by the incredible guilt tripping that goes on to this day.
Oh, absolutely. There's no doubt.
And so I feel like if a German were to be allowed to look at things clearly, which I don't think is ever going to happen in our time, because that's a frightening. Let's just say that Germany's already doing really well as it is, and if they weren't a nation of cucks, if they weren't a nation of cucks, they'd be doing far better, and they would be a fearsome opponent to the Anglo-US order.
Well, but Germans face fundamental problems here. Apart from the external guilt tripping, which has been ongoing to this day, there's a fundamental question in the Germans' mind as to what does it mean to be German. And because the thing that resonates most quickly would obviously be these very impalpable associations with World War II and prior to that World War I. You can say it's orderliness and progress and whatever, but these are really vague things.
Yeah.
And the other thing is Germans, whether it's probably is some genetic component, but Germans had this kind of obedience complex. There's something that I'm not an Anglo, but something I inherited from, I guess, growing up in the United States, or maybe it's just some odd, almost like qualia-like component of my being that I'm just kind of hyper-individualist. I don't just sort of bow down to what people say. But most Germans are like that. This is the way it's done. This is the procedure. We do it. And I think there's an awareness in the German consciousness of that if the guilt tripping, if they themselves stopped guilt tripping, and the people that do the guilt tripping on them were to relent, that there could be some danger that they might fall back into a pattern that is that could be destructive not just to themselves but the rest of the world. There's a lot of complexity there, but it's something I see in Germans that I've met. It's just they just kind of accept sometimes the most ludicrous things at the level of bureaucracy just because that's just the way it's done.
Well, I think I would put my theory out there that comes from the very suffering soul of the Germans. And I think that that Wagnerian moment in 1861, was it, when they were unified? That Wagnerian moment when everything came together and all those years of suffering that they inflicted on each other mostly came to an end. I mean, you had the French that inflicted a lot of pain on them, but mostly, I think if you look at the history of Germany, particularly in the Middle Ages, the Germans inflicted that suffering on themselves. And because of the petty nature of German politics and the quagmire that was the Holy Roman Empire, all kinds of stupid laws and hierarchies that just made no damn sense. But I think when you look at that Wagnerian moment where they all came together.
Sorry, 71. I just realized there's something. Sorry, I was just thinking
71.
Yeah.
10 years off there.
Yeah, it was close. Yeah. Well done. I had to just keep on thinking about that. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, well, thanks for the correction, though. I do love being corrected, to be honest. But I think that moment when everything came together for them was so profound that I don't see how you could ever tear something like that apart, where you just have such a zeitgeist moment where a nation that really is a cultural megalith just comes together. How can you ever tear that apart? And why would they ever want to be apart? And why would they ever want to work against each other again? And so, yeah, I definitely think I'll adopt the words of a Hungarian acquaintance of mine, older gentleman, 70 something, almost 80. He calls the Germans insect people because they stand in line and they hoard food together and they follow the hive mind.
And, I'm sure that sounds a lot cooler in Hungarian, by the way.
Yeah, rovar emberek.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's it's an interesting complex that they have. And I should say that I have, just like you want to learn Hungarian, I really want to learn German.
I wouldn't advise it. You know, and this is the funny thing that I got into discussions with a left-wing German friend of mine, and I've always been adamant about not being German, but it's undeniable that I've been so immersed in the language that it's kind of part of me. And so, I don't know, I wouldn't really recommend it. I mean, Germany doesn't really exist as a German. So when I first got interested in German culture and history, it was mostly a kind of philosophical interest in things like, Hegel and Nietzsche. This was years and years ago. And just a sort of intellectual tradition that I think arguably probably was best embodied in Germany for a few centuries at least. And I always made that connection. But anything resembling that is largely gone. It's been replaced. And I just don't see it there anymore. German's just sort of a language that people speak, but it's not. There's no connection to. You mentioned the zeitgeist of old. There's none of that.
The Wagnerian dream came tumbling down.
Yeah, I mean, and to be fair, in many ways, because I'm not really an alt-righter. I know who the alt-right would blame. The Germans are responsible for themselves. They had this sort of great colossus, a great tradition, and they sort of exceeded their own ambitions. And that ultimately led to the destruction of a German zeitgeist, and one that was actually transcended in a lot of ways. Because it could have persisted in some sense until today.
Yeah. It definitely would have.
Yeah.
But there's so much pain. I mean, it really.
In fact, just want to finish one thought. You could also argue that some of the first mistakes. I mean, if you look at the kind of intellectual productivity of the Austro-Hungarian Empire as well. Some of the greatest minds were produced there. I'm sure you know these guys. John von Neumann, for example. I mean, he created game theory effectively. All these people who were ultimately products of that time, and then with the initiation of the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the end of World War I, and then the subsequent mistakes. I mean, all this sort of comes tumbling down. A whole continental European tradition of amazing intellectual prowess, productivity, cultural creation. It just disappears, and it never finds a revival whatsoever. Sorry.
Yeah, but I think when I think of. Because you opened up basically a whole new can of worms over here with the whole Austro-Hungarian Empire. I mean, that's
my grandfather was a product of that. I'm kind of I'm somewhat fond of a past I personally never experienced. But when I look at the powerhouses and the cultural product of the time, it was incredibly impressive. I think you can't deny that.
My grandparents were also complete, totally Austrian bourgeois. Let's put it that way. The Hungarians, of course, but they were
same with my grandfather. Yeah,
Austrian school urban bourgeois, and I definitely think that that's something that's out of this world. And yeah, you told me, by the way, about your grandparents, and I kind of pictured them in my head because I know how those people live their life, and they have a little tin box with, black pygmy slaves in caricature on it. And they treasure that for their whole life because the little pastries they ate out of it were the best they ever had. The real Austrian, Vienna, Budapest, Prague, Linz, Austro-Hungarian life. It really an amazing thing. But I have to say that I wouldn't live that history again if it were up to me, because it was the product of a sordid history. European history is quite sordid, especially when you look at the German and Austro-Hungarian history. I would not repeat the value. I would not live out the values that my grandparents had. They were quite awful. And the way that they raised my father made him bitter for his whole life.
Ah, yeah, I'll
And
say my grandfather, I never met him. He died before I was born. But by all accounts, I mean, my father wouldn't like hearing this, but apparently he was quite the asshole. But yeah.
I mean, I couldn't say anything. I love my grandmother, but she's a manipulative, just an awful person by every scale of measurement. I love her. She's my grandmother. I love her. I learned so much from her. But she didn't make me a better person. She made me a worse person. And that's because, and I mean, that's something I wanted to get into about, there's a little bit of a black soul in that generation, and a little bit of a black soul in this whole area. It's really a negative vein that runs through it.
But surely you're contaminated. I know I've been contaminated, but not in. Well, when you say black soul, I don't mean a kind of perniciousness or a kind of malice, but well, I would liken it more to a kind of pessimism, as I said, a kind of.
There's that, but then there's also Schadenfreude.
Yeah, well,
Intense desire to see your peers fail so that you feel better about yourself. I can't put it more bluntly.
Yeah,
There's
I
a
don't.
desire to see your peers and your neighbors fail. It's very serious out here. It's incredible. and
Just
it's
briefly,
dense.
I would agree with you in as much, considering the Austro-Hungarian. I mean, we're coming in a period of history when the structure of monarchs were just, they were dying out, and we're coming in a period of sort of the nation state where the concentration of power isn't necessarily in a monarch, but rather in an elected body. I mean, we're talking about all kinds of transitions.
Yeah.
The Austro-Hungarian Empire could only exist in the epoch it existed because all the historical circumstances led up to it, allowed for its existence, and then finally led to its end were in place. I mean, but it's still there's still something to it. I mean, it's like I don't romanticize it to the extent where I would want to relive it, or I actually think a resurrection of that precise sort of international superstructure would be a great thing. But it's just an interesting thing and something that you can sort of reminisce about somewhat.
Well, but okay. So I did make the point about my grandparents and the way they lived, but I would say that there was also, particularly in Budapest, more so than in Vienna, in fact, there was also something good that we could take out of it, and that was the enterprising. That was the honestly, the very, very thick and tangible spirit of capitalism that was present in that period. And when you talk about the engineering advancements that were made, like let's look, for instance, at Tesla, right, and all of his inventions. Well, he stumbled upon the idea of alternating current here in Budapest, and he carried that with him to the United States, and he experienced that in his time working for the telephone exchange, which he was a leading engineer on here in Budapest, which was one of the first in Europe. And Hungary was actually, I could pull my friend in here who would tell you basically, he could list in under 10 minutes just by machine gun rate presentation all of the technical firsts that happened here in Hungary, and it's really incredible. Like the first two-car bus, with that consists of two different cars with a passageway at the center. The first electrical bus, trolley bus, or whatever you call it, and the first metro in continental Europe. The first underground train. So Hungary is just rife with these things, but they all come from this period where, first of all, let me pull out my parentheses, there were a ton of Jewish people here, and it was their golden age. And we're talking about Jewish intellectuals, and we're talking about the influx of the money that Jews had basically been hoarding away from the anti-Semitism of the previous period. So there was a huge exodus of Jewish money in the medieval period from Germany because there were so many purges. There was it was rife with anti-Semitism, and so they all basically fled to Poland and Russia, where there was no persecution. In Russia, there was more persecution by far than in Poland, but with the dissolution of Poland, at the same time that the Austro-Hungarian Empire reached its height, you had a massive influx of Polish Jews and, just more broadly speaking, Eastern European Jews with Slavic identities, or how should I say, Eastern European Jewish people were just pouring into Hungary. And they brought with them their thousands, 5,000-year-old intellectual and moral tradition, and they brought money. And so you had a situation where there was really not, in the fields of commerce and science, there was no anti-Semitism. And so really they were allowed to shine for the first time in about 1,000 years in Europe, with the exception, I would say, of medieval Spain before the Habsburgs. That's a interesting sort of side point, but the bottom line is that Jewish people do amazing things when they're empowered to, and of course they also have.
Yeah, they do definitely do amazing things. Yeah,
you have to give credence to their intellectual prowess.
Well, I absolutely do give credit where it's due. It's just that. Well, if you want to talk about toxicity of an outgroup identity, that's a whole different issue. But I just wanted to point to the fact that Hungary was really a safe haven for Jews at the time, and it replaced Poland as the safe haven. And the fact that you had the brightest minds of all religions, well, with the exception of Islam, the fact that you had the brightest minds of both secular society, Christian society, and the Jews of Europe was really a backbone. And I really don't want to sidetrack into Jewish politics. Well, I think you've already opened up a can of worms here. I mean, I don't deny. I don't deny that had a huge impact. I'm aware of it, and there were definitely positive things. But the insular nature of that community, and it's sort of discombobulated state in relation to people outside of the in-group, I think, well, it's undeniable. It led to many of the problems that were experienced later on. And yeah, I mean, it's a complicated issue. I don't see it as a black and white thing.
But we can I think say one thing for sure when it comes to Jews is that their outgroup status is something that defines them. So I think that
I would not disagree with that. That's for sure.
And it defines it in their own eyes as well.
Oh, absolutely. I would agree with that too. Yes, absolutely.
Look back to the Babylonian exile. Look back to the slavery in Egypt.
The question is,
in the old days,
this eternal outgroup identity coexisting with other identities and a refusal to fully assimilate has been the consistent pernicious problem for them since they left Babylon, basically.
Sure. And I think that they really find. I think that the place where you really see Jews addressing that for the first time is in the United States. I would really argue that the United States is the place where Jews really, when we're talking about the majority of people, and when you're talking about their self-identity, their own identity, the way that they view themselves, I think the United States is the first time, with the exception of almost Hungary, that Jews view themselves first as Americans and second as Jews. But I'm sure you knew a lot of Jews growing up. I knew them as well, and because in New York you can't.
They're everywhere. They're everywhere.
Jews, and I think there are a lot more Orthodox Jews in New York as well. But growing up in Los Angeles at least, and knowing Jews in Chicago as well, because that was my second home really. I definitely experienced that Jews in the United States consider themselves Americans first. And interestingly enough, in Hungary as well, you have that kind of attitude.
However,
So,
we both observe that in Hungary and the United States, they maintain this secondary identity and don't get rid of it. So, you know,
yeah, but that's hard. That's hard for them to eradicate, and it's also, I would say, the reason why they hold on to it is because it's good for them.
it's not. They think. See, this is where I would disagree. Jewish people think that this insularity and this separatism is good for them, and has led to a complete lack of self-reflection on their own part in regards to
I
this.
think the insularity and the separatism is something that was a defining characteristic in the past. I think it would be more accurately described, and it's on its way out when you look at Reform Judaism, and when you look at modern
It's
secular
still a
Judaism.
form of otherness, though.
Yes, yeah, it is, but I feel like that otherness is on the decline. I think it's really interesting to me how the question of Israel is a polarizing. I think this is the best defense that I can put out for Jews is that the issue of Israel is polarizing to Jews, and that there are a lot of Jews out there who don't agree with the Zionist mentality. Now, if I were to purport the Jews are all they're all they all carry this other mentality. They all want to be separate from the societies that they're taking part in. Well, then it would seem to me like there would be a consensus then in their community.
Well, I'd agree with you. I've looked at
about
stats in the States, and there's a lot of outgroup, sort of intermarriage and what have you. And that is a polarizing question for the tribe, no doubt.
and for a group that's unified themselves as an outgroup that are strictly tribal and strictly put one identity ahead of the other, wouldn't they all agree then on Zionism? Wouldn't that be
Well, I mean,
consensus
yes and
issue?
no. I was recently watching a film called Defamation that was made by an Israeli gentleman in 2008 or 9. And the very first conversation is a conversation with his Russian Jewish grandmother in her home. And she just starts talking about basically American Jews that are not named. And he's saying, well, why don't they want to live here? And then she says, well, because they'd have to work for a living then. They can just lend money over there. I think, here's the thing. I have a slightly different view. I agree that there's no real consensus per se, but I think that as in the most powerful and wealthiest demographic in the United States, it's hard to just sort of turn your back on that. And I think most of them keep Israel there as a sort of ejection option. I mean,
No, I think most liberal, well-to-do Jews in the United States would never consider moving to Israel because it's frankly a shithole.
well, I don't think there's very much attractive about Israel as a country, but yeah. So they have. Well, that's the thing. They have it better in the United States, but they all. I mean, maybe there are exceptions, but I've never met one. They all cling to some kind of vague identity, and I've talked to frankly about this, but I think the identity that the modern Jew has created for himself is an identity. He has an identity of suffering, of this quote unquote Shoah, of this sort of the world against me, woe is me, and therefore I need to maintain this outgroup identity in perpetuity. And I see this as a continuation of a destructive tendency that, okay, fair enough, you want to maintain your culture, but there will be people that are opposed to that, will not accept you. And it just creates a kind of cycle of almost a neurotic mental illness in that tribe that leads to no good ultimately. And I think it would be better for them, particularly the American Jews, if they would completely jettison that identity. But I don't think they can. Because
why? But I don't see. I think America is the one place where they shouldn't jettison that identity, because America is inherently a place where like you said, you can't replace in any fulfilling way your culture of origin with some melting pot bullshit culture.
But now we're getting the nitty gritty. That wasn't always the American dream. I do think there was an overarching Anglo spirit that was part of the American psyche that European people could amalgamate into their own consciousness, that through waves and waves of immigration and quote-unquote multiculturalism was systematically eradicated. The melting pot, this term, this isn't even an American term. It was coined by a Russian Jew living in England.
Yeah, but I would honestly say that when you look at New York, like you said about New York, for instance, and I think that you see, and I'm not speaking to New York, but I can speak to Chicago for one.
Okay.
You see that hodgepodge of European cultures, and I'll accept your history of the term, because I don't know anything contrary to that. I can't say anything contrary to that. I wouldn't want to reject it anyways, just on the basis of whatever. But I think of America as a melting pot because even in that European hodgepodge, these cultures in Europe itself would be at each other's throats. I mean,
I don't disagree.
Poles and Italians, you think Poles would love a group of Italians living in Krakow? In the 18th century?
No.
Do you think Italians
de facto it is a melting pot now. I mean, whatever the historical processes involved, that's what it is.
I feel like that's, and rightfully so, by the way, because I don't moralize about the conquest of America. I believe, I'm a firm believer, I'll just make this very clear, I am a firm believer in might makes right. And because that is an eternal reality. And I don't believe in moralizing about reality. I believe that we need to work around reality because you can never change. You can't change the basic laws of reality. You have to adapt to it. And that's a thought. That's something that Hungarians share, and it's something that I think Anglos see differently. Mm-hmm.
But I mean, as a question, you talk about Reform Jews in Hungary. Why maintain this art? Why not they claim?
Okay, so this is what I was going to get to. Was that I think that America should be a melting pot. Honestly, no matter who goes there. It's another question about accepting public policy that is detrimental to the majority of people there. That's a different question. But I think that Jews in the United States, if anywhere, should keep their Jewish identity. I think that Jews in Europe, on the other hand, should respect the fact that these are majority homogenous states.
Okay.
And they should not try to push the culture into making changes for their sake. They should adapt to the culture.
Right. So why do Hungarian Jews then maintain
because
this?
Hungary is also is not a homogenous country. That's the
perhaps
truth
not,
of the matter.
But there's a difference between a Jewish identity and a Hungarian identity.
Very honestly, I really have to say, and I would get a lot of flack from Hungarians about this, but I would say that the Hungarians are the most Jewish of all European countries.
Well, in their mentality,
to be honest, they hate outsiders. I mean, they hate people who aren't Hungarian. You can't, as a mongrel nation, which is the honest truth.
Yeah,
I'm a mongrel.
True.
I'm a mongrel. There is no Hungarian gene pool.
Well, that's true. I've studied this in depth, and the original Magyarok who came there have been absorbed largely by
right away.
It's kind of gone. Yeah.
This is the thing. Okay, and here's what makes Hungarians similar and different to Americans, is that Hungary is a mixed country. It's inherently multicultural, and when you look at the names of the street, I was basically saying that Hungary and the United States share a melting pot sort of nature.
Yeah.
And I think that it's apparent in Hungary because you look at now. I would say that the one thing that's more specific about Hungary is that it is a European melting pot. It's not an African and Asian and Arab and Indian melting pot. But it is a melting pot of European cultures, and that includes Jews. But what's different about Hungary from the United States is that there is the Hungarian language, and that is an incredibly difficult language to learn. It's something that is very unique, and that is kind of what defines you being a Hungarian.
Yeah, that's why I'll never be a proper one, sadly.
Yeah. I would say that that's probably all for the best.
Yeah.
I think now is a time where basically, I hate to say it, but Hungary needs to be open to people from around the world, and I don't mean it needs to be open to, African camel herders. I mean, it doesn't need to be open to, some illiterate peasant from the Afghan mountains. Like, that's not what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
But it does need to be welcoming to foreigners in general, because otherwise the Hungarians will have nothing to live off of. You need to be part of something bigger, because the reality is, if Hungarians sit here and they mire in their own pessimism, they're not going to create anything of value. They're going to be content with what they have, and they'll be content to either sit here complacently or they'll leave to find something better.
A lot of them have left. I've met Hungarians.
Yeah. This country is just bleeding people. It's bleeding, and it's bleeding brain power, unfortunately.
Yeah, it seems...
The best people don't stay behind, generally speaking.
Yeah.
There are exceptions to the rule, obviously, because I still live here with the brain drain in mind. Obviously, you meet people here who are exceptional, but I would say that generally speaking, and I should also say that the average Hungarian for me is far more tolerable than the average American. And so I don't want to make it sound like I'm shitting on all the people I live with, because that's not the case. But the people who are the drivers of society, because there's a difference between being a good friend to go out and drink with and being a driver of commerce and innovation,
Right. I mean, but see, my concern here is that commerce and innovation, I mean, that's just, with that, you just seem to get a kind of reflection of the American experience. And I'm a proponent of the idea that one of the reasons why you experience or you can witness this insanity going on in the United States is there's just there's no common experience to draw from apart from consumerism. But consumerism is not a common experience. I mean, you can say it is in some sense.
Yeah, but you can't sacrifice your material needs for some high idea of culture or heritage.
Well, I agree that there's a conflict of interest here. So it might be the case that every culture on the planet needs to cede its unique heritage or language, culture, etc., over to a sort of omnibus of consumerism. Maybe that's the case. I don't know. It's possible. Maybe it's inevitable.
I think I can draw a practical example here, like of what I'd like to see improve in Hungarian society. And slowly, like, I do have to bring it to a close because I'm starving and I haven't eaten
no problem.
dinner. But I think we should probably have a part 2. By the way,
yeah, no problem.
I think we have a lot here to talk about.
Sure.
But I think to leave you with a concrete example here is, for instance, Hungarian wines, in my opinion, are the best in Europe. But nobody knows that. And it's because Hungarians are not really burning to market it. They're not really burning to send it around the world. Some people have tried, but overall they fail because there's not an enterprising spirit. And I think that's not only bad for people around the world, but I think it's bad for Hungarians, because what is a young person here supposed to find pride in if people are just barely subsisting? And to be brutally honest, corruption here is rampant, because without corruption, you are just barely subsisting. I mean, anyone here who is making, for the most part, anyone here who is making above a meager subsistence is accepting money under the table. That's a stark reality.
Yeah.
And it's demoralizing on the basest level. It's debasing to know that you can't be honest about your income. and that goes from the lowest level of, how should I say, goes from the lowest of the low middle class up until the very highest tier of society. And so I am just as pro culture and pro heritage as you are. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. But you need to have something that gives you that pride. You need to have a
you're
sense
fortunate
that you're doing things the right way.
To have been born into the mysteries of the Hungarian tongue, and I was deprived of that. So I guess I have a lifelong task ahead of me, and I can amuse myself with that. So it's
I would say that if you were ever to come here, then you would meet people who are more than happy to share their experience with you, and I think, you know, it's totally, I'd say striving after this Hungarian identity is something that is not worth it.
Well, I mean, but this thing, I'm cognizant of the fact that I will never have. I don't really have. I mean, I've said this before publicly. I think I kind of have a pan-European identity, but it's not particular to any one country. It incorporates all the things I've learned, all the places I lived, and as much as I ever do move to Hungary and acquire the language in a competent sense, it would just be I guess a further incorporation of all the other things, because it's, you know, it's undeniable that when you live a life, an expatriate's life for you know, decades, then you don't really have a firm identity anywhere, and it's an amalgamation of different things. And there are undeniable American aspects to my you know, my being too, but
right.
I still wouldn't fully identify with that either. So I'm cool with that. I'm not.
I think, honestly, and I told you this yesterday as well, I think that's incredibly positive. I think what you just said is incredibly positive, because I really, as much as I'm a bloody sentimentalist about, you know, it might not be apparent because I actually work very hard to fight against my sentimentalism, and I play devil's advocate with myself anytime I hear something that makes me emotional. Mm-hmm. It's like a monastic practice that I force on myself, because I don't ever want to be like those people that I grew up with who got my feels and then they automatically think they know everything about something, and they make a biased one-off conclusion, a one-shot conclusion. Like that to me is the most that's the least desirable way of approaching things in my eyes. And so I think that as much as we're sentimental about our heritage, we have to be realistic about it. And I think I think a big step for Hungarians is going to be the loss first of that strong identity. And then I think that there were going to be people like me. My father he's as un-Hungarian as it can get. Like, he speaks Hungarian, he spoke Hungarian with mom, you know, his mother, but as a soul, he's all American. And it's clear in the fact that he would never come visit me here. He hates this country, and he hates Hungarians. And he hates everything that he hates the way they live their life. He hates their attitude about things. But, you know, that loss came full circle in the family. And I feel like there are going to be other people who have that same kind of thing. So there's different ways that culture maintains itself.
I have a sense of appreciation, but I'm not sentimental. I don't really have that quality. Mm-hmm. I think it's more of appreciation of things that have existed and how that's informed me and made me. But I wouldn't
But
necessarily
that
call
is
it
a bit of a
sentimentality.
sentimental attachment, no? Like I think that sentimentality is not something that we should be ashamed of by any
I mean,
means.
there is some, yes, there, because I'm human and weak, that there's some latent sentimentality there, but I'm also somebody who thinks that Europe is effectively doomed and that there probably is no recourse. So whatever
But you have the
sentimentality.
sentimentality, and that's so important. It's important that we hold on to that.
Well, it's a careful balance between our emotional whims and the hardships of reality. And I think
Yeah.
that we need to focus on reality if there's any hope for Europe and Western civilization in general, and I think the globe, because I think that the Western civilization has had its greatest impact on the globe and has had the greatest impact, then we need to be cognizant of the past, have some kind of appreciation for it, but we cannot get so lost in the past that it blinds us to current events. So maybe you're right that Hungary needs to open up in some sense. You would be more capable of making that judgment than I, since you speak the language, you've lived there for a couple of years now. Maybe that is the way forward. I don't know, but I do know that we cannot get lost in sentimentality and just say, it was great when it was in such a way. It was great. I remember when Europe was Europe, but that's gone now. So
Yeah. But you do need some kind of sentimentality, and sometimes it has to be irrational. I mean, because you can't get lost in over rationalizing things to yourself. Like we should hold rationality as an ideal, but we also have to have those gut convictions. Otherwise we get weighed down in our rationalizing. You have to, like, I could rationalize till the end of the day of why multicultural Europe is good. To be frank, I mean, I could talk to you about a lot of economic reasons why we should.
but when you say multi, you're not counting the African
I'm
camel
counting
herders.
the whole world.
Oh,
No, not the
okay.
camel fuckers or the camel herders. Excuse
Okay.
me. But I mean, when it comes to actually discussing our demographic realities, and I mean, I really don't want to open that can of worms.
Yeah,
But
well, you probably need to get
in
something
a future
to eat.
discussion, I would be happy to talk about that with you.
Yeah, we can
But,
do. Yeah, sure.
But I think that at the end of the day, you have your instinctive love of something. And if you spend the whole day rationalizing against it, then how do you get out there and preserve what you love? And so I'll leave it on that note.
Okay, that sounds good. Let me
Yeah.
thank my guest for participating. I hope that was a illuminating conversation. And with a bit of luck, if the RNG gods are with us, then he will appear in the future. So until the next time.
All right. It was a pleasure, man.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.